Welcome, everyone. My name is Charles Stanhope, and I'm the representative of the Board of Trustees of the Southwest Harbor Public Library. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's library event. We're delighted that you're involved and invested in the programming at SWPL, as they say, and we know we couldn't do it without all of your support across the community, but we do it because we have your support, and we're delighted to bring you as a part of this year's Camden conference, as you saw on the slide, this interesting and engaging presentation this evening. The Camden conference's theme this year is Europe, Challenged at Home and Abroad, which culminates on February 25 through February 27 in Camden. And I know you're not going to take this down, but you can easily find all about the Camden conference at www.camdenconference.org. If you haven't already done so, engaged listeners, readers, and learners that you all are already. We are recording this program, and it will be accessible later this week on the library's YouTube channel. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the session, and at the end of Paige's presentation. Library Director Erich Reed is facilitating the question and answer. Please feel free to use the chat feature throughout the presentation. So I'm very pleased on all of our behalf and on behalf of the library to welcome our speaker tonight. Paige Herrlinger is the Associate Professor of History at Bowdoin College, where she has taught since 1998. Her courses include Modern History in the Soviet Union, Germany 1918 to 1945, and the Holocaust. And when I looked up her bio at Bowdoin, it says she either was teaching in the fall or is teaching this spring. Bad Women Make Great History, Modern Europe as Lived and Shaped by Women, 1789 to 1968. And A History of the Holocaust, Context, Experience, and Memory. So she is fully fledged and fully invested, and her research has taken her down what I know are on an interesting journey. She received her BA at Yale and her PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and her research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the American Philosophical Society. So we can all be proud as American taxpayers that our support for the National Endowment for the Humanities facilitates intellectual stimulation that Paige is able to present through their support. Don't forget that when you are filling your taxes this year. There is a good place or two where they go in our country. She's also, speaking of the NEH, she's also currently co-director of an NEH summer seminar for middle and high school teachers teaching the Holocaust through visual culture. And if time permits, we may give her an opportunity to tell us what that is all about. So without further ado, it's my really distinct pleasure to warmly welcome Paige Herrlinger to the Southwest Harbor Public Library this evening. Over to you, Paige.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you everyone for inviting me here. It's a pleasure. I mean, I always hesitate to say that when the subject is the Holocaust, but it's something that I feel deeply passionate about, and I think it raises some very core issues that we are still wrestling with. So without further ado, I'm going to get my PowerPoint started here. Share it with you. Okay, I have my own slide, my own title here. Just draw your attention to the quote at the bottom in case you are not familiar with it. I think it sets an important tone for what I'm going to be talking about this evening, the importance of memory and its consequences. So without any more ado, I want to get started here. Okay, so I realize that many of you have probably heard a lot about Russia in the last few weeks with very good reason. And when I first started writing this talk back in early January, we hadn't quite gotten to the Ukraine border yet. But the headlines about Russia were already pretty discouraging, at least from a human rights perspective. You might be familiar with this figure on the screen right now. Alexei Navalny There was, of course, an assassination attempt on him last year, and then he was arrested and put into prison, not for the first time, for being the most vocal opponent and political rival to Putin. If it were up to Putin alone, he would probably be erased from the public square altogether, and they're literally trying to do that in this image on the right. The caption there is something like "Hero for a New Time," and they're literally whitewashing him out of existence. If you dig a little deeper into the Russian news, you might know this man, Yuri Dmitriev, who is a historian like myself, who is now serving a 13-year prison sentence. Originally arrested on trumped-up pornography charges, his real crime, and that's in quotes, has been to investigate Stalin's crimes. He is part of a much bigger movement to silence and attack those people who are dedicated to uncovering the truth about Stalinism, the Gulag, and in the process are tarnished as quote unquote foreign agents, which is a very popular term in official Russian, akin to foreign spy. And this includes people like myself, as I said, historians who are trying to get at uncomfortable truths about the past. Now, this latest wave of attacks on people like Dmitriev began back in 2012 and intensified in 2014 with the uprising in Ukraine. Even more recently and discouragingly, you might know that Russia's oldest and most prominent human rights organization, Memorial, was shut down just this last December. Also accused of allegedly failing to comply with the foreign agent law and actually supporting, these are the charges, charged with justifying terrorism and extremism by bringing visibility to about 400 individuals who are current political prisoners of the Putin regime, including Navalny himself. Now, this case is still under appeal and we'll see what happens, but I think we can all agree that from a human rights perspective, it's certainly not a good thing when you look at the list of things that Memorial is committed to. This is from their website. This gives you a very quick view of their role. And Memorial has been in place doing this kind of work since the 1980s. It is the center of human rights in Russia today. So the fact that it is being silenced is certainly a problem. At the same time, however, Putin's record on Holocaust commemoration would seem to be trending in the opposite direction, with greater attention given to the Holocaust in terms of education and commemoration than ever before. Just to give you a few examples, including the one here, Putin has recently shown up at big commemorative events. He was actually an active supporter of this Jewish Museum and Cultural Center, which opened up in 2012. He's very close to the chief rabbi of Russia, who I think kind of sold him on the idea of this museum, not only to educate a new generation of Russians in the spirit of, or in the education about the Holocaust, but also the spirit of tolerance, and to celebrate Russia itself as a model of the coexistence of different religions in a multinational and multi-confessional society. Apparently, Putin was so impressed by this idea, by this mission, that he actually donated 1 month of his own salary towards the creation of this museum. Another example, Putin speaking at the World Holocaust Forum now 2 years ago at the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, at which he sounded a lot, maybe like we would want him to sound, denouncing Nazi crimes, labeling the Holocaust essentially the darkest and most shameful page of modern world history. He then went on in the same speech to talk about how important the memory of the Holocaust was as a lesson and a warning, and how important it was to tell the whole truth, and that it is the job of current and future politicians and state figures to make sure that this history is told, to protect the good name of the living and fallen heroes and the civilians and victims of the Nazis and their allies. So it's all good, right? Possibly. I'll hang out, get back to that one in a second. Most recently, just about a month ago, some human rights activists actually came to Putin and expressed concern that the Ministry of Education had left off January 7th, which, as you might know, is the recognized International Day of National Remembrance of the Holocaust, and the Russian Ministry of Education had kind of conveniently left it off the schedule for the year. It's not an official holiday in Russia, but it has been celebrated since 2016. And so they came to Putin and said, what's going on? And he expressed surprise and actually said, no, we should in fact commemorate the day. So what does this mean? How can we square these two trends? On the one hand, the shutting down of the main human rights group in Russia on the one hand, and then greater Holocaust education and commemoration on the other. So with that in mind, I'm going to explore Russia's record on the Holocaust and consider what it can tell us about the way in which Russian national identity is thought of today. It'll reflect a little bit on Putin and on Russia's relationship more broadly to shared European values and priorities. And I know, given the events today that are going on today in Russia, this might seem a little far afield from our very pressing concern about Ukraine. But I do think that a better understanding of Russia's position on the Holocaust can be very revealing, especially in terms of how Russia sees its position vis-a-vis the West, Western values, as well as Western politics. Okay, to do this, I want to go back in time a little. I am a historian after all, to the beginning. No, I want to give you a brief overview of the Soviet position on the Holocaust. The easiest thing to say about it is that the Soviet Union did refuse to recognize the unique suffering of the Jewish people throughout the Soviet period. But it was also true that from the very start, the Soviet state's position on Nazi crimes was political, very, very political. So before the Nazi-Stalin Pact in 1939, for example, Stalin's regime was very happy to highlight evidence of Nazi anti-Semitism and violence against Jews. But then with the signing of the pact, it conveniently stopped very suddenly. After the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, however, it resumed publishing news about the atrocities, this time in occupied Poland. And in November 1942, at the height of the Battle of Stalingrad, the Supreme Soviet established what you see here, this extraordinary state commission to investigate Nazi crimes, fully aware that it was useful to its own interests, the state's own interests, to collect evidence of Nazi atrocities, in order to attract support for the war effort, both at home and with respect to its Western allies. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which was also formed in 1942, was central to this effort as well. Yet even at this stage, the state was very careful to suppress information about Jewish suffering specifically. For example, in the case of the massacre at Babi Yar in September 1941. Now, most of you might know about Babi Yar, but just in case you don't, I'll give you a very brief history. It happens very soon after the German occupation of Kyiv, and it involved the massacre of over 33,700 Jewish men, women, and children in this massive ravine known as Babi Yar. The Nazis then continued to use the site for mass murder throughout their occupation. Victims included Roma people and other ethnic minorities, as well as prisoners of war and patients at a nearby psychiatric hospital. Yet, when the Extraordinary Commission went to file reports, it expunged information about the Jewish victims, as you see here, conveniently, actually all too simply, replacing this one phrase here that identified the Jews as the victims. Now, there are many other examples of this kind of suppression. It would continue for much of the Soviet period, but it involved things like the attempt of the wartime correspondent, Vasily Grossman, to report on what he discovered when he returned. After reporting about the war throughout the Soviet Union, he returned to his home in Ukraine to find that the Jewish population had virtually disappeared, including his own mother. And as he tried to report on this, he was not allowed. Likewise, when he and Ilya Ehrenberg tried to publish the book you see here on the right, the so-called Black Book, which was a collection of testimonies, letters, and diaries from Holocaust victims, the book was suppressed in 1948 on the grounds that it seemed to suggest that the Germans had fought the Soviet Union with the sole purpose of destroying the Jews. So what's going on exactly? Well, a historian by the name of Klaus Goran Carlson points to three main concerns at work in Soviet efforts to subsume both Jewish suffering as well as Jewish heroism under Soviet suffering and heroism. The first concern is that the great Soviet victory against fascism would be muted if attention were directed towards the fate of Jews specifically. And this in turn would deprive the Soviet Union of the legitimacy that it had gained through victory. The second concern is that attention to the Jewish populations in particular would result in charges against local non-Jewish populations who collaborated with the Nazis or were in some way responsible for the atrocities. And a third concern is that the patriotism, the Soviet patriotism that had been stirred up by the war had also brought out some other less attractive things like anti-Semitism and xenophobic nationalism. I would add one more concern, and that this is that that drawing attention to the Jewish victims might have drawn unwanted attention to other forms of ethnic-based violence that took place under the cover of war, and this time by the Soviet state itself. For example, the forced relocation of the English people. So the Soviet Union, on the one hand, did not deny that the Holocaust happened. After all, the state had collected evidence to show that it had. But at the same time, and especially after 1948, it would pursue an active policy of silencing and suppressing information about it. History books instead would focus on the war as a collective experience of the Soviet peoples, with an emphasis on unity, sacrifice, and achievement. In fact, the historian Nina Tumarkin has argued that the focus in the Soviet Union was on the unique suffering, and that's in quotes, the unique suffering of the Soviet people during the war. And I'll let you read this quote here, but just want to highlight the fixation on the Soviet Union's victimization. They didn't think in terms of 6 million Jews as victims of Nazis, but rather the 20 million Soviet people that had died. And actually it's more like 27, but at the time 20 million was the term, or it was the number that was circulated. They focused on their own victimization. Tumarkin further argues that while anti-Semitism partly explains the official refusal to acknowledge Jewish suffering, an even more important explanatory factor is what she calls the psychological economy of suffering. It goes something like this, quote, "The Germans had meted out to the Soviet people a more horrible fate, and to have granted the Jewish people an equal, or even in terms of this logic, higher status on the pecking order of martyred nationalities would have vitiated somewhat the Soviet claims on behalf of their own victimization and was therefore impermissible." I'm coming back to that in a second. So this does not mean that no one remembered. In fact, there is a lot of grassroots efforts to commemorate, particularly at Babi Yar, for example, to commemorate the massacre and to remember those who had been killed there. And most of them, by the way, at the time were Soviet Jews, the ones who remained. But their pleas got absolutely no traction from the Soviet state. Khrushchev not only refused to erect a memorial, but decided to turn the site around Babi Yar, which is almost 400 acres, into a sports complex, and to construct a dam there, as if to literally bury all the remaining evidence of the massacre. But within about a year of the construction starting, the dam burst, drowning the local population in the landscape in mud in March of 1961. Was this a coincidence? We don't know. In any case, the project was devastated, but the silence continued. And it was in this context that Yevtushenko's famous poem, Babi Yar, was published the same year as The Flood. And it's part of a broader effort on the part of not only ordinary people to remember the Holocaust, but also artists to take up what the state was unwilling to do. And the editor who allowed the publication of this poem was in fact fired for that. It wasn't until 35 years after the fact, in July of 1976, that there was finally a monument erected at Babi Yar. And even then, there's no specific reference to the Jewish people. The dedication reads only to the memory of the, quote, Soviet residents, soldiers, and POWs who were shot at Babi Yar by the German occupiers. And the initial plaque was in Ukrainian, followed later by Russian and Yiddish plaques. The monument itself is also pretty odd. It was created by a Ukrainian sculptor, Mikhail Lysenko, and it was originally supposed to feature a Jewish family, but in the final stages of the project, that idea was replaced by this, which is, what we're seeing here is actually 11 heroic figures in Soviet monumental style. So instead of Jews, once again, we see the brave Soviet people fighting against fascism. There's a soldier in there, a sailor, a partisan, some women, etc. So it is a very emotional piece, but the emotion elicited really does very little to commemorate the Holocaust itself. Nonetheless, it would serve as a site for future memorial services. And if you're wondering why 1976, the answer for this, I mean, I don't know for sure, but according to William Corey, it's a response to international criticism levied against the Brezhnev regime for not fully implementing the recent Helsinki Accords, that is basically for its poor record on religious and human rights of national minorities. And in that respect, I think it stands as the first, but not last time, to use on the part of the state to use Holocaust memorialization as a way to position Russia more favorably in a global context, and we'll be coming back to that. So the bigger shift around memorialization really doesn't come until the mid-1980s with Glasnost, when you start to see the word Holocaust finally appearing in the press, and the publication of Grossman's novel Life and Fate in 1988. But to be clear, we're still talking about mostly a grassroots effort to revisit the question, and official textbooks like the one you see here was still kind of in the same Soviet fashion, putting the focus on the victimization of, in this case, the Slavic people, Soviet people, rather than the Jews themselves. It's really only in the 1990s that there's a major, profoundly major shift with the founding of this organization here, the Russian Research and Educational Holocaust Center in 1992. It still exists today. This is a recent snapshot of their website. It's affiliated with Yad Vashem and the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, which includes funding from the EU. As the title suggests, its main goals are to foster research on the Holocaust, but also to promote the introduction of the Holocaust into secondary schools and universities. etc. So it's a very important resource, and happily it does still exist. A little later in the 90s, the first Holocaust museum in Russia appears as part of a reconstruction of the synagogue here in Moscow, which is dedicated in part to Holocaust victims. Now, the shift in the 90s is in part a kind of natural result of moving away from the Soviet past, but again, also in part a response to the international context where Holocaust memory and memorialization was particularly active and widespread. Essentially, if Russia, or in fact any post-Soviet state in Eastern Europe, wanted to feel in conversation with the West, which was very much in vogue in the 90s in Russia, then it needed to demonstrate sensitivity towards the Holocaust. And of course, this was a lesson that was made clearest to states in the Eastern Europe as they vied for inclusion in the EU. But it was also an important, it was important to many groups in Russia as well. Commemoration of the Holocaust in the 90s, though, was also in part a reaction against growing nationalism and anti-Semitism in the 90s. It was a very challenging time in Russia for many reasons, and Jews once again became a scapegoat for a lot of Russia's problems. There was even a rise in Holocaust denial on the new far right, in which the Holocaust was seen as a Jewish lie perpetrated against Russians, first during the revolution, then during the terror, and then even during the Yeltsin period. But nonetheless, Holocaust education was expanding by the late 90s, largely through the efforts of individual teachers rather than the state. A turning point came in the early 2000s with the inclusion of the Holocaust in the Russian standard of history education, making the mention of the Holocaust compulsory in textbooks across the nation. This does not mean, unfortunately, that the education was always more than cursory. It's clear that Holocaust education has not gone far enough. The most famous case of this were the now infamous Karatigina sisters, who were on a game show in 2011 and asked to define the Holocaust. After conferring with each other, apparently came up with this brilliant answer, wallpaper paste. So clearly Russia has a long way to go, as do we, in terms of Holocaust education of the younger generation. In any case, when Putin came to power on the last day of 1999, he seemed prepared to continue the trend of Holocaust education, or at least unable or unwilling to stop it. He even appeared to agree with the premise of Memorial and to the idea that policies based on a deep analysis of facts and theories and views could secure a society's stability and interests in the long run. So this was hopeful. At the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz in 2005, he stepped up, emphasizing the inhumanity of fascism, of the Holocaust, and really made it very clear that he saw it in contrast to the, quote, humanitarian values and democratic traditions associated with the course of European history. The Holocaust, he seemed to acknowledge, along with other European heads of state, quote, constitutes the absolute non-negotiable evil in European history. Yet, as historians have since pointed out, Putin's understanding of acceptable Holocaust narratives still seemed to be much in line with his Soviet upbringing. Even at that speech in 2005, he still did not mention the Jewish identity of the victims, of the majority of the victims, and instead drew attention to the 600,000 Soviet soldiers who had given their lives in order to liberate Poland, and to the 27 million Soviet citizens who had lost their lives to the war. So effectively doing what had been done all along to bury Jewish suffering under a bigger Soviet blanket of suffering. But more than this, Putin demonstrated a willingness to instrumentalize the Holocaust for political reasons, specifically warning about the more contemporary threat of terrorism. And at that time, the big concern for Russians was the threat of Chechen violence, Chechen terrorism. So he used the Holocaust as a way of denouncing that. Under his watch, we can basically see two different trends in Russian Holocaust commemoration. On the one hand, we see the expansion, the continued expansion of Russian scholarship, educational efforts, and cultural attention, especially on the grassroots level, but with some official support. On the other hand, there remains an unwillingness in official Russian memory practices to give a full account of the Holocaust. As well as an unwillingness, as well as a willingness to use the Holocaust for political and geopolitical ends. So as I mentioned before, like Putin has stepped up and talked about, especially since 2016, the importance of joining the rest of the world in commemorating January 27th. So it seems like progress, right? However, I think he does this largely because he believes that the Holocaust is effectively territory that still holds benefit in terms of Russian patriotism, in terms of the way it understands itself as a nation and it understands its status vis-a-vis Europe. So the focus is still on the Soviets as liberators. Of course, January 27th is the day commemorating the liberation of Auschwitz by Soviet troops. So as Europeans choose to remember the victims, the Russians can use the same occasion to remind everyone that it was the Soviet army who liberated the camp, and thereby claim responsibility, justifiably, for saving not only some Jews, but also European civilization. Okay, I want to give a few examples to show sort of the tension here. The first is the fact that at this Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center, which, as I said, was supported by Putin, one of the more recent memorials, and really as I say here, the first significant Holocaust memorial, is actually dedicated to Jewish resistance. Apparently with some approval from Putin. But what's interesting is the way in which even the focus on Jewish resistance still conforms to sort of leftover Soviet narratives about the Holocaust. What do I mean by that? Well, if you see here the story of, you can see the screen in the back with a Jewish partisan fighter. And this is kind of common. There are video testimonies of these former fighters, complementing sort of more intimate documents like letters and photographs and personal papers. Now, seeing this kind of a testimony would have been unthinkable in the past, in the Soviet period. But on the other hand, it's still within the Soviet narrative. Jews are kind of added in here to the heroic Soviet story of liberation and the fight against fascism. And the introductory text of the display here reads, like the entirety of the Soviet people, Jews participated in the defense of their motherland. Okay, another quick example. You may have heard that this huge blockbuster film, Russian state-funded and therefore state-approved film, Sobibor, in 2018. Now, this again is a unusual move for the Russians because the history of Sobibor, and particularly of Pechersky, the hero here, was long buried. Pechersky was a Soviet army officer, but he was also Jewish, and he led this famous escape in 1943. And I think it's interesting the way that the story was recast. This is a very violent film, and in many ways it does actually get to the heart of what the Holocaust was about. But I still think you see this tension where in the picture itself, the photograph itself, advertising the film, you see, I mean, looking at Pechersky in the center there, or the portrayal of Pechersky, he looks like a Red Army soldier, Soviet Army soldier, right? Rather than a Jew per se, right? And the subtitle here is also interesting. A podvig, that we have forgotten, right? The escape from Sobibor, which is very much a Russian Orthodox term that indicates this great, almost miraculous spiritual feat. And I want to know who's the we here, who's we have forgotten. So I think, again, you see this tension between acknowledging the Jewish past, but also linking it to Soviet heroism and by extension, Russian heroism. So another really quick example, because I realize we're moving, I'm running out of time here, is this Liberators Project, and that put forth by this Holocaust Research and Educational Center. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with this, but it's one of many recent projects that are contributing to educating the public about the liberators, Soviet liberators. Not necessarily to the exclusion of Jewish stories, but certainly there's a lot more of this going on. The balance is not really there. Okay. To understand, I think, what's going on here, to kind of, if we can try to get in Putin's head a little bit, I want to just talk for a minute about some of his statements about his thoughts on history per se. He's made them actually pretty clear. He meets with historians, not me, unfortunately, but he meets with Russian historians. And at a conference in 2007, he made it very clear that he thought the humanities were important because history was a good means by which to transmit the, quote, best traditions and values of our national culture to the younger generation. Now, for him, this meant a number of things. It meant courage, sacrifice, collective action, but also toleration. Tolerance is in our blood, he claimed. So in supporting the idea of research and open inquiry and even competing viewpoints, as opposed to, a single official ideology, he's not really worried that there's a problem there, a contradiction. Because quite frankly, he believes that the more people dig into history, the more they're going to discover Russia's greatness. In other words, for him, studying history is inevitably going to lead people to a love of Russia. But at the same time, just in case it doesn't, he believes that those who are critical of Russia's history are wrong or engaging in lies, right? And this has been a theme with him to the extent, and I have more to say on his position as a historian, but I think it's really this idea, this belief in Russia's past is really at the core of what's going on here. But he's also a very good strategist, and so although he pretends that his faith in his history, in Russian history in particular, is strong, he had a plan B that he put into place in May of 2014 when he moved forward with a new, quote, memory law, which essentially criminalizes anyone who tells lies about the Soviet Union during the Second World War. Now, this is super ambiguous on purpose, because that means, who knows what does it mean to tell a lie about the Soviet past? So it leads, in fact, to self-censorship, much as we've seen in the case of Poland's memory law that came out in 2018, where people are afraid to speak out for fear of being, of getting in trouble. So anyway, in this sense, I think we could see Putin as what Mark Adele, the historian, has called a positive nationalist, who sees a kind of monolithic, triumphalist narrative of Soviet and Russian history as a foundation to a strong authoritarian state. And the Holocaust, he believes, can help him accomplish this. All right, back just to kind of wrap things up here in a couple minutes. I want to go back to the speech I mentioned at the beginning in 2020, because there are two things going on here. As I've made the case already, there is an attempt to accentuate the Soviet role in the liberation of the Jews, but also of Europe from fascism, to save Europe from fascism. But at the same time, and you see this here, the importance of remembering, all that kind of stuff. I'm going to put that up there so you can take a look at it. Red means please read this. I know it's a lot. But it's subtle, and so you need to kind of see the text, right? We're gonna focus on the liberation of Auschwitz. We're gonna focus on the escape from Sobibor because these are our heroic narratives. We will never forget this. But at the same time, we should not forget that this crime also had accomplices. And here's the second way in which Putin sees the Holocaust as useful to his aims today. The other claim, or the other point of his speech, is to call for a full investigation into Holocaust crimes. And on this score, obviously the Nazis are the biggest criminals, but they're not the only ones. There are other collaborators in other Eastern European countries, particularly in some of those countries, including Poland, but also including Ukraine, that he hopes very much to continue to dominate. So it's part of that kind of hybrid strategy of using history as a way to attack, to undermine the integrity of these other nationalities in the area. And this has really come out in the case of Ukraine most recently. As some of you might know, there's a massive Ukrainian memorial project underway now at the Babi Yar site. There's going to be some 12 buildings across 370 acres. Unfortunately, I'm going to be honest, if you look at where this thing is located, Babi Yar is just a little bit to the north of Kiev, which is like right where the Russian troops could very well come through very soon. So I don't know. And please don't ask me at the end whether I think the Russians are actually going to go over the border again. I'm as confused as you are. But in any case, there is this huge project underway. It is taking, I've done some research into this, and a lot of historians are involved in this Ukrainian project, and it's really trying to take a very balanced approach towards showing a full history, both those who could be considered heroes in the story, but also those who were collaborators, and there were, of course, collaborators in Ukraine. And it's not going to shy away from telling that full story. The Ukrainian president Zelensky, you might know, is Jewish himself, and has been a supporter of this project. But what confuses some people in Ukraine is the fact that the backers of this big project are actually Russian oligarchs. Many of the bigger backers, including the oligarch Mikhail Friedman, who has his own past in Ukraine, and says this is an emotional project for him. It's about his distant family, relatives, etc. Zelensky, for his part, says, look, anybody who lays a stone in honor of the victims will have my blessing. But then the counter argument is this a Russian effort to undermine Ukrainian identity, especially vis-a-vis Europe, to make us look like Nazi collaborators? And so there's been a lot of back and forth, even within the Jewish community in Ukraine. It's very divided. The real aim of the project, says Yosef Zissels, who is the vice president of the Ukrainian chapter of the World Jewish Congress, he says, if you look at the timing of this, which the project emerges right as the ceasefire is put into place in the eastern part of Ukraine, he says, Putin wants the world to see Ukraine as a pariah, as a nation undeserving of statehood, a country of nationalists, anti-Semites, and neo-Nazis. So this is the fear. Is this paranoia? Perhaps. But Putin doesn't care, because the strategy is just to create this kind of division, to create this kind of doubt, to undermine and to divide unity in Ukraine, but also in the rest of Europe over this issue. And there's a great book, if you're interested, by a historian named Yelena Subotic called Yellow Star, Red Star, who investigates the contested memories of the World War II era, specifically in Eastern Europe, and looks at the split between those who focus on the victims of fascism and the Holocaust versus those who were victims of communism, and talks about the ways in which this issue presents a kind of foundational challenge to the EU specifically, because the EU and European identity today is very much tied to the victory over fascism and the Holocaust and to human rights remembrance. And she says, by these debates and the effort to stir up these debates really threatens a unified European narrative and therefore threatens to destabilize the Union itself. She also mentions that it could force Western European countries to revisit their own pasts with respect to collaboration as well. In any case, Putin seems to understand this vulnerability and is trying to capitalize on it to Russia's interests, of course. So he's shoring up Russia's status as a liberator of Europe. And actually, at the end of his speech, and this is my very final point, he calls on the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and says, hey, look, we should get together as preservers of civilization and sort of hammer out the future. Now, this was 2 years ago. A lot has changed since then. I don't think he'd really gotten a lot of traction on this idea, although he had some. I'm pretty sure now he's not going to get that meeting to happen. But I think it is interesting that he's trying to use the Holocaust as a way to claim a new kind of Russia's legitimacy as a preserver of civilization and to really kind of give it a bigger seat at the table on the future of the world, essentially. So I'm going to leave it there, stop sharing, and I would be happy to entertain questions if anybody has any.
And if anyone has a question, they're welcome to raise their hand with the feature at the bottom of their screen, and you can ask it directly, or you can use the chat feature to ask a question. So one question, oh, okay, we have one from Harold here. So help yourself, Harold.
I think you might be muted.
Unmute yourself. Let's see, ask unmute.
Yeah, mute. Yeah, excellent. But they're minor, but they still, I think, were interesting. You didn't have to bring it up, but the whole cosmopolitanism thing in Eastern Europe after the war, the show trials mostly against Jews, is sort of one thing. Don't have to get into it because it was quite minor in terms of, but it was the Slansky trials, for example, were clearly anti-Semitic. There's no way to get around that. And then also Russian foreign policy in the Middle East, utilizing anti-Israel opportunities here and there were part of the picture as well during this time. So I just wanted to mention those things.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's there are many dimensions I skipped over, but you're absolutely right. I think what's one thing I didn't tease out either is the extent to which obviously the anti-Semitism campaign in 48 and to the basically starting then and till Stalin died. What's interesting to me is that it was effectively denounced, and yet the policy with respect to the Holocaust narrative remains seamlessly intact. So that is a constant, but yeah. Thank you for that.
Sure.
So, okay, all right. Looks like Charlotte, yourself. We've got to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I have a question about Putin's enthusiasm for reviving the Russian Orthodox Church and where this fits into his perhaps his position on treatment or the history of the Jewish community, or his willingness to engage in the establishment of memorials.
So I do know quite a bit about the church. I don't have any direct evidence of the church specifically with respect to the Holocaust memorialization, although they have been very present when it comes to, say, Memorial and the so-called Wall of Grief, which I didn't talk about, which is a memorial to the victims of Stalinism, and they have been very visible there. I do think we can assume that the church is used very strategically by Putin to bless things that it's willing to bless. But a lot of these very more political issues are kind of outside the church's sphere. On the other hand, I think when you're talking about the role of the Soviet people in the war, it gets a little bit more interesting because, as you might know, Stalin, after years of persecuting the church as an institution, Stalin effectively made peace with the church in the interest of fighting the war. And knowing that the clergy and the remaining believers would be more willing to fight, to defend the idea of Russia as opposed to the Soviet Union, which of course was atheistic and secular. And this had happened in the First World War, and it was actually very important to the waging of the Second World War. Morale was not very high, in spite of the fact that everybody hated the Nazis once they arrived. Not everybody, but most people. Morale was, people weren't really all that excited about fighting for Stalin, but they were willing to fight for Russia. And in their minds, Russia, the church was a representative of a deeper Russian tradition and sense of national identity. And that has been revived under Putin for sure, that sense, that deep connection. There's been a lot of talk lately too about the First World War and the experience of the First World War, which for the entire Soviet period was also kind of covered up. But the church played a big role in mobilizing the Russian people to fight that war, seeing the war as a kind of punishment for its own secularization, even for its revolution in 1917. So the church, the intersection between the church and politics, I guess, in short, is complicated, and Putin instrumentalizes the church, the faith as well. In terms of the Holocaust, though, it is complicated. There's still I'm part of a broader consortium of Russian Orthodox scholars, actually, and we have talked a lot about issues like the clergy after the Gulag and sort of the legacy of trauma and violence in the Soviet Union. And the church at this point is still working through its own trauma and the victimization of Orthodox believers under the Soviet regime. Don't think they've got yet enough bandwidth to be able to start talking about anything more at this point. There's a lot to work through, in other words. And that's where I see most of the discussions when it comes to Orthodoxy right now. So I know that doesn't directly answer your question, but I hope it gives you a little bit of context at least.
Thank you.
And as a Holocaust sort of educator, is, you know, with the sort of inevitable passing of Holocaust survivors and sort of the, you know, persistent Holocaust denying, you know, deniers and cultivation, is there, like, going forward, is it like these sort of video testimonies and museums, like, does that give us good cause to have optimism that the ground won't be lost?
Yeah, so yes, I mean, we're very fortunate to have a lot of testimonies, although I think anyone who's ever met a Holocaust survivor and had the chance to speak to them would know that it's not quite the same experience, but yeah, we certainly have the material to work with. I think art too is a really powerful way to connect people with the suffering that people endured in the Holocaust. I think what's really striking to me in recent years, you know, we think of his Holocaust denial, I think in a very overly simplistic way. We think of it as just, you know, people who just don't, you know, like I talked about the new right in Russia, like denying denying it, just like outright deny, or kind of sort of using it to their own ends. I think what we're seeing, though, is Holocaust denial is a many-headed beast, and it really does have a lot of different manifestations. And I do think that some of the things that, for example, that Putin is doing, as well as I should say some of the politicians in our own country are doing with the memory of the Holocaust and using it for different ends, is a form of Holocaust denial, right? Appropriating the Holocaust to different purposes. Historians can make very good comparisons that can be very productive. Although there's a whole line of argument that says nothing is comparable to the Holocaust, right? It is a unique experience. I would say that's true of all human experience, but that doesn't mean we can't go through the exercise of comparing and contrasting, as long as, we do justice to what we know to be true. But I think the ability to appropriate, the ability to downplay certain parts of it, like Jewish suffering as opposed to the suffering of other victims. Of course, this is an argument that we have in Holocaust commemorative circles in the United States. To what extent, for example, do we talk about the persecution of homosexuals as part of the Holocaust? If a lot is written about that, and what size room do they get in the museum next to the suffering of the Jews? I mean, these are very thorny issues. I don't call that denial, but it's stuff we have to work through. And I think it can be very productive for students and younger people to think through these issues. But I think we have to keep the fight on, and we have to keep as many people engaging in thoughtful and careful discussions about it, because those testimonies are valuable, but only if you know what to do with them and make of them, and only if you watch them and listen to them. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also concerned, and this is why I'm putting a lot of effort into trying to keep the Holocaust education alive and well. But thank you for the question.
All right, thank you, Harold, and then Charles.
Yeah, a slightly different question, but I'm surprised in all of this discussion about Russia right now that nobody points out more how pathetic the economic side of Russia is. If you consider, I think our, not now, Basha, I think it's something like 64,000 per capita is the annual GNP per person in the United States. In Germany, it's in the high 50s. In Russia, it's about 10,000. I mean, what a pathetic picture. And the total inability to sort of give when they had that opportunity 30 years ago, and look where it's now. If you could comment on that as somebody who
on the economic side of things.
Away a little the Holocaust thing, but it's something that's sort of I've been scratching my head on.
Yeah, I mean, I do. If you look at the statistics on cost of living, and disposable income, there's no question that under Putin, things have gotten much better for most people in Russia. So it's all relative. I mean, yes, it's not even across the board for sure. Rural areas are still, wildly under-supported, and the economy is still very fragile in certain places. Of course, it's also very tied to fossil fuels, and so they've been lucky to a large extent in the last 2 decades under Putin. But sure, there are economic worries, and there are certainly people who are unhappy with that. And Putin, some of this is about Putin trying to distract people from the inability of the state to live up to some of its own promises. Of course, one of the biggest sources of devastation for a lot of people in the post-Soviet period was the fact that all of the social services that the Soviet state had provided were suddenly not necessarily discontinued, but weren't funded anymore. They just didn't have the money. That has also changed a little bit. So, when we compare incomes, you also have to keep in mind sort of what people get from social services. But Putin's economic, the economic growth under Putin, there is fear that it cannot be sustained. It hasn't been sustained. It's definitely lesser than it was, but it explained his popularity at first. So now that he's not benefiting quite as much from that, yes, he does need to come up with different ways to keep people behind him. On the other hand, I think he understands the Russian people better than most of us, right? And one of the things that I think we made a mistake about in the 90s was to think we'd won the Cold War and Russia was doomed to be a marginal country for the rest of time. This was a big mistake, I think, on our part. Russian pride is something that Putin gets. And whenever he can stoke it, whether it's at the Olympics or it's at, with the help of his armed forces, he understands that it can go a long way. And the younger generation especially is very active in terms of sort of its patriotism in ways that I don't think we appreciate either. So yeah, it's a balancing act for him, but I do take your point that the economy is important to factor into the equation for sure. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right, Charles, can you unmute?
I was just going to follow you, Paige, in your talking about sustaining the story and educating. You're educating the next generations at Bowdoin. You're participating valiantly, I know, with the NEH, teaching the Holocaust through visual cultures. How often have you been able to do that? And are you finding receptivity and interest, which I pray you are, to integrate Holocaust resources into teaching in the presumably above 8 through 12 or whatever grades you've got? Just give us a thumbnail. We've come up to the end of our time, but it seemed to me opportunity to look ahead as well with the importance of continuing to be convincing of the truth.
Yeah, so this the NEH has funded this seminar twice, and we can keep applying, but twice so far. And what we do is we solicit applications from school teachers all over the country. We try to get as many states represented as possible. Still, I'm not sure what the current number is, but it's a very small minority of states that actually mandate the teaching of the Holocaust in its curriculum. So we try also to go for those teachers who don't have quite as much support. And we try to give them very creative and visually focused ways to reach students today with this really heavy but important topic. And so far, it's been a very rewarding experience. We do have a lot of teachers who are interested. And luckily, through their various social networks and Facebook and so forth, they're able to reach out to other teachers. And so, if we can get a small group of kind of converts and they get some good ideas, we're hoping that it kind of takes root and they spread it and share it. And we can make sure that we really shore up Holocaust teaching, not only because it's important, but we need to find a way to meet this younger generation who, grew up on Snapchat and Instagram and who really need new tools for accessing these kinds of topics. So that's what we're doing. And
thanks. You're equipping them to give a much better definition than those 2 Russian girls about what the
I
Holocaust
sure hope
is.
so. I can't think of a worse one, but I bet you, I have 4 kids myself. I bet you I could find some American kids who would give pretty stupid answers to the same question. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do.
And one quick follow-up parochially, are you getting teachers from Maine participating in it?
Yeah, and actually we partner with a local teacher who kind of goes through the application process with us. And then we always have a few Maine teachers as well. So we definitely look for Maine teachers too. Yep.
Thanks very much. Erich, I'm not feeling like I'm responsible for summary comments, but it seems to me we are at the moment where we want to thank Paige and welcome her back. And when she can come to Southwest Harbor, come and see us in person. Am I correct in that regard, Erich?
Yes.
I would love this. Anytime in July or August, I'm there. No.
And the other thing, which I was going to suggest with Paige's recommendation of this book, Yellow Star, Red Star, perhaps the library, knowing the subscribers to our event this evening, can be sent the bibliographic information and where the book is available, if they're interested in pursuing that, or even other resources that Paige might suggest to us that we could share with those participants this evening who want to. We used to have a program at the Library of Congress, read more about it. If they want to read more about it, we'll be glad to help direct them to authentic sources.
Great idea. Mhm.
So I'm going to say goodnight on all of our behalfs. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day. Stay well, stay warm, be prepared for the next storm.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.